know that moment when someone who's always been there for you, texting back first, making the plans, overthinking, every silence suddenly goes quiet, stops chasing, stops caring? That's not peace you're feeling. That's the start of a storm. This is what happens when the anxious finally walks away. And if you're avoidant, if you've built your life on distance and detachment, this right here is your wake-up call. Because here's the truth. That person you thought would never leave, the one you secretly counted on to keep showing up no matter how many times you pulled away, they're done. And now, the very thing you were trying to avoid, intimacy, connection, vulnerability, is the thing you suddenly crave. Welcome to the nightmare you didn't see coming. Avoidant attachment often hides behind a powerful illusion, the belief that emotional distance equals control. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, closeness can feel threatening. It can feel like pressure, like obligation, like a loss of independence. So they create space, intentional or not, because it makes them feel safe. In that space, they believe they hold the power to regulate how much intimacy they allow, the power to choose when to engage and when to withdraw, the power to stay just out of emotional reach. And because the anxious partner usually leans in, tries harder, loves louder, and tolerates more, the avoidant gets used to this dynamic. They interpret that imbalance as evidence that their strategy works. They get to maintain distance while still being loved, pursued, and emotionally cared for. It feels like control. But what they're really doing is building a relationship on emotional quicksand. That control isn't real. It's a fragile defense mechanism dressed up as self-sufficiency. It's fear masquerading as strength. Because the truth is, no real connection can exist where vulnerability is blocked. And the avoidant knows this deep down. They feel it in the moments of silence after an argument, in the pit in their stomach when their partner's tone shifts, in the way they secretly crave connection but have no idea how to ask for it. They've spent so long avoiding emotional discomfort that they mistake numbness for peace. They confuse detachment with strength. They rationalize distance as independence. But it's not power they're holding, it's a ticking clock. What the avoidant doesn't see until it's too late is that their anxious partner has a limit. There is a point at which the giving stops, the trying ends, and the overcompensating runs dry. The anxious partner who once clung to hope and tried to fix everything will one day realize that they're pouring energy into a void. And when that moment comes, when the anxious finally walks away, it shatters the illusion completely. The so-called control the avoidant thought they had dissolves instantly. Suddenly, they're not the one choosing to disengage. They're the one left alone. And that shift in dynamic is terrifying. Not because they love being chased, but because that constant pursuit allowed them to avoid facing their own emotional walls. As long as the anxious partner was showing up, they never had to confront what they were missing. But when the anxious walks away, they're left in silence. And in that silence, they hear everything they've been trying to drown out: the loneliness, the insecurity, the fear of being known and rejected, the pain of never truly letting someone in. This is the moment the avoidant realizes they were never in control at all. They were surviving, not thriving. They were managing fear, not mastering connection. And the person who just walked away, they weren't needy. They were resilient. They held on until they couldn't anymore. And now the avoidant is left facing the emotional consequences of their own walls. It's not that they don't care. It's that they never learned how to show care in a way that builds trust and connection. And now that absence becomes their teacher. What they thought was strength, this ability to detach, to regulate alone, to protect their heart, was actually avoidance rooted in pain. And once the anxious partner is gone, all those feelings they've spent years pushing down come rushing up, not because they've changed overnight, but because the coping mechanism no longer works. Distance no longer gives relief, it gives regret. Silence no longer feels peaceful. It feels hollow. And control, it was never control. It was fear with a mask on. So when the anxious finally walks away, it's not just the loss of a relationship that hits the avoidant. It's the collapse of a carefully constructed illusion. They are left standing in the rubble of a dynamic that always felt safe, because someone else was carrying the emotional weight. Now they must face themselves, not the version they've projected, but the one that struggles to sit in discomfort, to trust love, to say, "I need you," without shame. It's a brutal mirror, but it's also the beginning of real change. because the illusion of control can only survive in the presence of someone willing to chase. And once that chase ends, reality begins. The anxious partner in a relationship often takes on a silent but heavy role, the emotional caretaker. They're the ones who overthink every text message, replay every conversation, and try to read between the lines of every silence. Their nervous system is wired for connection, but not just connection, reassurance. They need to know they're safe, wanted, and not on the verge of abandonment. This doesn't come from weakness. It comes from a deep-rooted survival instinct, shaped by early experiences where love may have been inconsistent, unpredictable, or conditional. So in relationships, the anxious partner becomes hyper-attuned to shifts in mood, tone, or behavior. They sense withdrawal before it's fully happened. They feel the distance before it's spoken. And because of that, they act quickly to fix, to soothe, to close the emotional gap before it grows. What's often misunderstood is that this anxious behavior is not about control. It's about safety. The anxious partner is constantly working to secure the bond. They text first, they apologize first, they initiate hard conversations, and they often take responsibility for emotional conflicts, even when they're not the root cause. It's not that they don't see the imbalance, it's that they fear what could happen if they stop trying. In their mind, disengagement equals danger, and so they double down, they over-explain, they people-please, they give second, third, and fourth chances. They accommodate the avoidance need for space, even when that space feels like abandonment. They suppress their own needs in favor of keeping the peace. This emotional labor is exhausting. It's like constantly running on a treadmill that's slightly too fast. You can keep up for a while, but eventually you burn out. The anxious partner often carries both their own emotional load and the avoidance. They regulate they stay emotionally available even when their own needs go unmet. They show up again and again, trying to earn what should have been given freely: connection, security, presence, and often the avoidant doesn't even realize this is happening. From their perspective, the anxious partner is just too much, too sensitive, or overreacting. But behind every overreaction is a history of being unheard, unseen, or dismissed. Behind every anxious plea is a deep desire to be chosen without condition. The longer this dynamic continues, the more the anxious partner starts to internalize the belief that love has to be earned, that they have to be less needy, more chill, less emotional, more of whatever the avoidant needs in order to finally feel safe enough to open up. This self-abandonment becomes routine. They learn to suppress their voice to maintain the relationship, but it's a slow erosion of self-worth, because every time they reach out and are met with withdrawal, they learn that their needs push people away, that love is conditioned, that they have to shrink to be loved. What they don't see in the moment, because they're too busy fighting to hold things together, is that they're doing the emotional work of two people. They're holding the weight of the relationship on their shoulders. And eventually, even the most loyal, most forgiving, most emotionally invested partner runs out of capacity. They hit a wall, not out of anger or revenge, but because their nervous system can't handle the one-sided strain anymore. Their need for peace and self-preservation finally outweighs their fear of abandonment. And that's when the shift happens. This shift is often quiet. There's no big explosion, no screaming match, just a slow detachment. The texts get shorter, the questions stop, the checking in fades, and that absence, the one the avoidant never expected, isn't a punishment. It's a boundary. It's the anxious partner choosing themselves. Maybe for the first time, choosing rest over chasing, choosing dignity over desperation. And when this happens, it flips the entire dynamic. The person who always tried is now the one letting go. And the person who always pulled away is now left with the silence they once craved. But now it feels different. Now it feels cold, final, irreversible. And the avoidant begins to feel what the anxious partner has felt all along: the weight of emotional distance. But the anxious partner didn't walk away because they stopped caring. They walked away because they got tired of carrying it all alone. They reached their emotional limit. And in that moment, the true cost of their labor, their emotional generosity, their willingness to fight for connection, their relentless hope becomes painfully clear. It wasn't weakness. It was love in its most committed, selfless form, until it couldn't be anymore. There comes a moment in every unbalanced relationship when something shifts, quietly but irreversibly. For the anxious partner, that moment is the breaking point. It doesn't always come with fanfare. There might not be a big argument, a dramatic goodbye, or even a clear explanation. Sometimes it's as simple as waking up one day and feeling empty, tired, done. After months or years of trying, of reaching out and receiving silence, of compromising and never feeling truly seen, something inside them clicks, not with bitterness, but with clarity. They realize that love shouldn't feel like begging. Connection shouldn't be so one-sided. And being in a relationship shouldn't mean constantly chasing someone who's always emotionally 10 steps away. This breaking point doesn't happen suddenly. It builds over time. It starts with small moments, a message that goes unanswered, a need that's ignored, a vulnerable truth that's brushed off or dismissed. Each time the anxious partner tells themselves it's not a big deal, that maybe the avoidant just needs space, that if they're patient, things will improve. But deep down, they're slowly draining themselves to keep the relationship alive. They silence their own needs to preserve the fragile thread of connection. And all the while, resentment begins to grow, not loud and explosive, but quiet and corrosive. What makes the breaking point so powerful is that the anxious partner often doesn't see it coming, not even in themselves. They're used to trying harder when things get difficult. They've built a habit of fixing, forgiving, and adjusting. But emotional exhaustion has limits. You can't keep pouring from a cup that's bone dry, and when they finally hit that emotional wall, they don't just slow down, they stop. Not out of spite, but because continuing to give starts to feel like self-betrayal. This moment is confusing for the avoidant partner. They've gotten used to the dynamic, the anxious partner always reaching out, always circling back, always ready to repair the rupture. So when that cycle breaks, the avoidant is caught off guard. Suddenly, the texts stop, the check-ins disappear. The anxious partner, who once seemed so emotionally dependent, is now distant, composed, maybe even indifferent. This doesn't match the avoidant's internal narrative. They believed the anxious partner would always be there, no matter how many times they withdrew or shut down. That belief gave them comfort. It gave them control. And now it's gone. The avoidant might try to rationalize it at first. They're just trying to get a reaction. They'll be back. But something feels different this time. There's no anger, no protest, just space. Real painful space. The kind of space that makes the avoidant realize just how much emotional stability the anxious partner provided, even if it went unacknowledged. The anxious partner didn't just fill the silence. They held the relationship together through their consistent emotional investment. Now, without them, everything feels unfamiliar, unstable. For the anxious partner, walking away isn't a victory. It's a loss too. It's the death of hope, the letting go of a dream where love could have been mutual, where safety could have been built, where the effort could have been returned. It's not that they stopped loving the avoidant. It's that they started loving themselves enough to walk away. They realized that staying in a place where their needs weren't met was doing more harm than good, that they were teaching themselves every day to accept less than they deserve. And something inside them finally said, enough. This is a powerful moment, not because it hurts the avoidant, but because it liberates the anxious partner. It allows them to reclaim the energy they once spent trying to be understood. It gives them the space to rediscover their own worth outside of chasing, outside of overgiving, outside of the loop of trying to earn love. It's the first real step toward healing their attachment wounds, toward choosing relationships where connection isn't earned through self-sacrifice, but given freely from both sides. And for the avoidant, it's a mirror, a moment of reckoning. They now face the consequences of emotional distance. They see what happens when someone stops fighting to stay. And if they're willing to be honest with themselves, this breaking point can become the beginning of their own growth. Because when the anxious partner walks away, it doesn't just change the relationship, it changes the avoidant's entire understanding of what connection means. When the anxious partner finally walks away, the avoidant partner is thrust into unfamiliar territory. For so long, they've relied on distance as a protective mechanism. Emotional closeness has felt suffocating, overwhelming, or even dangerous, so they've managed relationships by keeping people at arm's length. They've grown used to a rhythm, withdraw when things get too intense, pull back when vulnerability is required, lean out when the other leans in. And because the anxious partner almost always closes the gap by reaching out, apologizing, seeking reassurance, the avoidant has rarely had to face the true consequences of their emotional detachment. But when that dynamic ends, when the anxious stops texting, stops checking in, stops trying to fix things, it sends the avoidant into a state of confusion and often panic. At first, they might not realize it. Avoidants are experts at staying disconnected from their emotional world. They intellectualize instead of feel. They downplay instead of confront. So when the anxious partner stops showing up, the avoidant might tell themselves it's no big deal, that they needed the space anyway, that it's a relief not to have to manage someone else's emotional intensity. But that's not the full story, because over time, the silence that once felt comforting begins to echo. The space that once felt safe starts to feel empty. They may find themselves checking their phone more often than usual, wondering why there's no message. They may notice the absence, not just physically, but emotionally. There's no one there asking how they feel, no one trying to understand their walls, no one filling in the emotional blanks they never knew they left behind. And the discomfort starts to rise, not because they've suddenly become someone different, but because the pattern they relied on has collapsed. This is the beginning of the avoidant's internal crisis. It's not the loss of the relationship that shocks them most. It's the unraveling of the emotional system they've depended on. They were used to being pursued, forgiven, accommodated. Now there's no one doing the emotional work for them. No one stepping in to maintain the connection. They're alone with their thoughts, their defenses, their fears, and those things are much louder when no one else is there to distract from them. What follows is often a wave of emotions that the avoidant has spent a lifetime trying to avoid. Loneliness creeps in first, not just because someone is gone, but because they suddenly realize how much connection meant, even if they never admitted it. Regret follows, regret for the things they didn't say, the moments they pushed away, the love they kept at a distance. Then comes fear. Because if someone who always stayed could finally leave, then maybe no one will stay. Maybe all the space they fought so hard to preserve wasn't safety, it was isolation. This emotional unraveling can feel like panic. It's not loud or dramatic on the surface, but internally, it's disorienting. For the first time, the avoidant is forced to confront the impact of their behavior, not through conflict, but through absence. There's no fight to distract from the pain. There's no partner demanding explanation, just silence. Just the weight of what was never said, never shared, never nurtured. And in that silence, the avoidant begins to feel what the anxious partner has been feeling all along: disconnection, rejection, abandonment. But here's the difference. The anxious partner lived with those feelings and still showed up, still tried, still loved. The avoidant, on the other hand, kept those feelings buried until now. And now that they're exposed, it's overwhelming. It's not just heartbreak, it's a confrontation with their own emotional avoidance, with the realization that they pushed away the very thing they needed, that their defense mechanisms, while protective, also cost them the chance at real intimacy. This is their emotional reckoning. Some avoidants in this moment double down. They retreat even further, convince themselves it wasn't meant to be, that they're better off alone. But others, those who are ready to grow, begin to ask deeper questions. Why did I push them away? Why was their closeness so hard to receive? Why does this silence hurt more than their presence ever did? Those questions are painful, but they're necessary. Because the nightmare isn't the absence of the anxious partner. It's the exposure of the emotional void that was there all along. The difference now is that there's no one else to fill it. The avoidant must finally face themselves. Not the image they project, but the part of them that longs for closeness, yet fears it. The part that wants to be loved, but never learned how to accept love without feeling trapped. And in that confrontation, the path to healing begins. Not through someone else's efforts, but through their own willingness to feel what they've always avoided. When the anxious partner walks away, something unexpected happens. The emotional roles that defined the relationship begin to shift. For so long, the anxious partner was the one reaching, yearning, trying to close the gap. They were the emotional initiator, the one constantly seeking connection, reassurance, and security. Meanwhile, the avoidant partner relied on space, distance, and self-containment to feel safe. They often appeared detached, in control, and uninterested in emotional intensity. But the moment the anxious finally lets go, everything changes. The very dynamic the avoidant depended on begins to unravel, and with it, so does their emotional certainty. At first, the avoidant might try to rationalize what's happening. They may convince themselves that it's temporary, that the anxious partner is just being dramatic or testing them. They might tell themselves that they're better off without the pressure, without the emotional neediness that once overwhelmed them. But slowly, a quiet discomfort begins to build. The messages don't come. The emotional check-ins disappear. The emotional labor that used to be done on their behalf The explanations, the forgiveness, the efforts to bridge the distance is suddenly gone. And in that silence, something stirs that the avoidant wasn't expecting. Longing. At first, it's confusing. The same closeness that once felt threatening now starts to feel like something they miss. The presence they used to push away is now an absence they can't ignore. The avoidant begins to remember the warmth, the consistency, the care that the anxious partner brought. They remember the late-night talks, the gentle reassurances, the way the anxious partner always fought to stay, even in the face of emotional rejection. Suddenly, all of that feels precious. And with that realization comes a painful truth. What they once rejected, they now crave. This role reversal is not just emotional, it's existential. The avoidant, who built their identity around independence and self-sufficiency, now finds themselves feeling emotionally hungry. They begin to question whether their version of safety was ever truly safe. They wonder if the space they valued so much was actually a form of emotional starvation. And they begin to feel the loss, not just of a partner, but of the emotional intimacy they never allowed themselves to fully receive. This craving is difficult to navigate because it's unfamiliar. The avoidant has spent years minimizing their emotional needs, avoiding dependency, and keeping people at a distance. So when the need for closeness finally surfaces, it doesn't feel natural. It feels overwhelming, vulnerable, and even shameful. They may not know how to express it. They may struggle to identify what it is they're actually feeling. But underneath the confusion is a deep desire to be seen, to be understood, to be held, not chased, not pursued, but met in emotional truth. What makes this shift even more painful is the awareness that they may have lost the very thing they're now yearning for. The anxious partner, after so much emotional labor, may be beyond the point of return. They may have found peace in their own detachment. They may have started to build a life where their worth isn't determined by how much emotional work they can do for someone else. And that realization hits the avoidant hard, because for the first time, they're not being protected by distance. They're being punished by it. Now, the avoidant has to confront the contradiction they've lived with all along, that while they pushed love away to feel safe, they also needed it deeply. They have to face the fact that emotional safety doesn't come from isolation. It comes from connection. That independence, when it becomes avoidance, can turn into emotional deprivation. And that vulnerability, the very thing they feared, might have been the path to everything they now wish they had. This reversal isn't about punishment. It's not karma or revenge. It's the natural result of a dynamic that was never sustainable. The anxious partner's withdrawal leaves space for the avoidant to finally feel. And in that space, their emotional truth surfaces. For some, this becomes a moment of growth. It becomes the beginning of healing attachment wounds, of learning to express rather than withdraw, to lean in instead of pull away. For others, it becomes a missed opportunity, a source of deep regret, a lesson learned too late. Either way, the shift is undeniable. The avoidant who once ran from closeness now longs for it. The emotional roles have reversed. And with that reversal comes a new understanding that connection isn't something to fear. It's something to nurture before it's gone. So here we are on the other side of silence. The anxious partner who once gave everything to hold the relationship together has walked away not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. And in that space, the avoidant partner is left with the very thing they thought they wanted, distance. But now that distance feels nothing like freedom. It feels like loss. It feels like reality finally catching up to avoidance. This speech isn't about blame. It's about awakening. It's about seeing what happens when one person carries all the emotional weight for too long and what can unfold when that weight is finally dropped. It's about recognizing how fear, whether of abandonment or of closeness, can quietly poison a connection that had every chance to be real, deep, and lasting. For the anxious, walking away is not weakness. It's growth. It's reclaiming your voice after years of whispering. It's learning that love should never come at the cost of your own emotional well-being. And for the avoidant, this is a mirror, a chance to face the part of yourself that confuses distance with safety, silence with strength, detachment with control. But if there's any hope in all of this, it's this: awareness creates the possibility for change. For the anxious, that means learning to self-soothe, to hold your own emotional ground, to stop chasing what hurts. And for the avoidant, it means learning to lean in, to sit with discomfort, to risk being seen and loved in your full emotional truth. Because in the end, relationships don't break when one person walks away. They break long before that, in the quiet moments when connection is needed and one partner is already halfway out the door. But healing begins when we stop running from each other and from ourselves.